One of the things that often rocks the testimony of Mormons is when the historicity of the Book of Mormon is called into question, and it appears that there might be some conflicts between science and the Book of Mormon. The truth is, however, that usually what is thrown into question isn't the historicity of the book itself, but rather the narratives that we as individuals read into that text. This is never more on display than when the issue of DNA is raised as a critique to the Book of Mormon. I mean, if the Book of Mormon is true and details the account of a Middle Eastern family's settlement of a portion of the New World, we should expect to see that DNA from Middle Eastern people and some Native American populations should match, right? Well, maybe not so much. Ken Peterson joins me again on the podcast to break all of this down. By the end, I think you might find out, like I did, that many of the so-called conflicts between the Book of Mormon and DNA research are more conflicts with the narratives that we as people construct about the Book of Mormon and that DNA research. And that's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So a few weeks back, I told you about a new online merch store I was putting together and that I would let you know as soon as that was up and running. Well, after a few weeks of working on designs and testing it out personally, we're ready to launch. So if you go to MormonRenegade.com and click on the Renegade Supply button in the top right of the landing page, or click the link in this episode's show notes, you'll see that we have 16 items right now that you can choose from. We have shirts, hats, bags, cups, and water bottles, all with the Mormon Renegade logo, as well as a couple other designs that I think you'll find really funny. And maybe even one where I take a slight shot at BYU, but you should definitely go check that out. Now, this is just the beginning. In the coming weeks, more designs and styles will be available for purchase. Now, all the proceeds I get from this are going to go right back into the podcast. So head on over to MormonRenegade.com and press the Renegade Supply button, or click the link in this episode's show notes and get yours today. Ken, what's going on?
Everything. Just living,
I hear you.
Enjoying life and watching and keep my eyes open for the end of the world, that stuff.
Yeah, just that stuff, right? Well, dude, have you heard about the red heifer?
Yes.
To me, that's crazy, right? Like, they don't show up often. Like, there's been like 9 of them, and there's only supposed to be 10 before, quote, Messiah comes, according to Jewish tradition. And yeah, I'm just saying, we got that going for us now. So we have red cows.
A lot going on, yeah.
My first thought was, do they taste like normal cows? Like, I'm kind of intrigued now, right? Like,
what's your first?
Right after is Jesus is coming back. My next thought was, how does that cow taste?
I wonder how red heifers taste. Yeah. How would I prepare that?
Right. Are we talking like 2 minutes each side? Get the nice grill mark, salt and pepper. I mean, what are we talking? But
true carnivore.
Anyway, dude, I am so jacked up for this one. DNA in the Book of Mormon. So for the longest time, believing Mormons have kind of been beat up over this issue a little bit, right?
Oh, and it keeps coming back.
Yeah, like people keep saying, show us somebody with Middle Eastern DNA here. And so right. When you told me about this, I was like, oh, we got to do this one. We've got to do this one.
So I remember the morning it first hit the papers that I was aware of. I was teaching elders quorum at the time, and I was preparing the lesson, and I got the Sunday paper, and the headline was DNA proves the Book of Mormon false. Ooh. I changed my priesthood lesson, and away we went. But we'll get into all of that. Once again, I'm always grateful for these chances with you to get all my ducks in a row, so to speak, to get all the information together and look at it again. And you always learn something new in the process. And and always am struck with a sense of wonder, the marvelous work and a wonder that the restored gospel is ultimately coming out the other side. So we're gonna go down some rabbit holes. I'd like to start with just a primer. It's going to feel like a biology class for a minute. A nucleus, the headquarters of the cell, and within the nucleus, as you can see, are chromosomes, and those chromosomes are comprised of DNA. What is DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid is the molecule that carries genetic information for the development and functioning of an organism. It's the computer code
Right.
that determines every aspect, physically, mentally, and otherwise, of who and what you are outside of behavioral traits that we are influenced within life. It's
I've heard.
made of two linked. It's like a ladder that twists around, like a twisted ladder. The double helix is what it's called. DNA was first discovered back in about 1874 by this doctor who was cleaning up, saw some pus on a bandage and noticed some stuff on it. But the double helix hadn't wasn't identified until the 1950s, 1954, by Dr. Watson and a couple others, and they won the Nobel Prize. DNA analysis was first used for identifying perpetrator of a crime in 1986 to show you how kind
Yeah.
of how recent it is. And we won't talk about uh, these four bases that create the rungs of the ladder. The sequence of the bases encode the biological information, such as the instructions for making a protein or an RNA molecule, which is the messenger molecule. The person who wrote this that I'm quoting here from the genome.gov then says this very, very interesting thing. Is there a more amazing molecule than DNA? It makes each of us who we are. The DNA from any two people is 99.9% identical, with that shared blueprint guiding our development, forming a common thread across the world. That's kind of neat to know.
Yeah.
The differing 0.1% contains variations that influence our uniqueness, which, when combined with our environmental and social context, give us our abilities, our health, our behavior. How can one single molecule contain so much mystery and wonder? I'll think about it. Every cell of your body has this computer code, this genetic fingerprint that is responsible for making you who you are. And
Hmm.
there are no two of us that are the same. Now, a little more detail just to talk about the complexity of this molecule. So what you're seeing is a chromosome, which kind of shows you how the DNA is coiled around inside of it. DNA usually occurs as linear chromosomes in eukaryotes and circular chromosome in prokaryotes. The set of chromosomes in a cell makes up its genome. The human genome has approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA arranged into 46 chromosomes. A gene is a sequence of DNA that contains genetic information and can influence the phenotype of an organism, which are its physical characteristics,
Right.
or all of its characteristics. This image here is a diagram of how the DNA cell replicates itself. Reading from left to right, it divides itself in half and then reassembles itself with another half, thereby creating two strands of DNA where there was just one. So not only is it super complex, the way it replicates is like a machine. I mean, look at all the parts and the processes involved. The things that the things that we utterly take for granted. In humans, the total female diploid nuclear genome per cell, so one nuclear genome in one cell, extends for 6.37 giga base pairs. That's 6.37 billion
Holy
base
cow.
pairs. It is, if there's so many of them that it would stretch 7 feet. You couldn't even see it, but it would be that. That's how much.
Wow.
Male
Seven,
value is a little less. Anyway,
seven
each
feet?
yeah,
Holy cow.
208 centimeters. Each DNA polymer can contain hundreds of millions of nucleotides, such as in chromosome number 1, which is the largest human chromosome with approximately 220 million base pairs. It would be 3.5 inches long if it were straightened out. All right. You get so as I was putting this together, the sense of awe and wonder. I mean, the first time I heard about this in biology, I was going to sleep, but as an adult, I'm going, wow,
Yeah.
this is miraculous. This is evolution is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Evolution. Yeah. Yeah. It's fantastic.
How, prior in one of our earlier discussions, we talked about there are various scientists who are jumping ship from
Right.
Darwinism, most of them being molecular biologists. And just looking at what we've looked at in terms of how the cell is run and how the body is coded and how it's produced, how in the hell is this stuff supposed to self-assemble from nothing? How does that happen?
Well, and just the complexity, right?
Yeah, right.
Just the complexity of alone is enough to say no, it's computer code, right? And just like all code, there has to be an author.
With billions,
Right.
billions of bits of code. So the Wikipedia website on DNA is really it's more information you'll ever want to know. But one of the sections that I really wanted to quote because I thought you would find it interesting is how DNA and its relevance to human evolution. And here it is. DNA contains the genetic information that allows all forms of life to function, grow, and reproduce. Duh. However, it is unclear how long in the 4 billion year history of life DNA has performed this function, as it has been proposed that the earliest forms of life may have used RNA as their genetic material. Why would they say that? That is a straight up admission that abiogenesis, life spontaneously generating on Earth,
Right.
especially in the form of DNA, is impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an admission. Oh, well, then it must be something simpler that evolved like RNA. RNA is half of DNA. So instead of the whole ladder, you only got one
One
side with the
side.
rungs attached to it, right? You know what the problem is with RNA?
What's that?
It doesn't replicate. It doesn't replicate. It can't recreate itself.
So there's
DNA replicates.
there
RNA does not.
it would be a lot like again creating something out of nothing.
Yes.
Sure.
The complexity of that, let alone to get it to work, let alone to have a male species and a female aspect of the species combine to reproduce, which is also interesting because each cell has different forms of DNA in it and they never interact. They stay in their own zones until reproduction occurs. Only then does the DNA recombine the male with the female.
Interesting. Now
Evolution is miraculous.
I was going to
How
say
it how it
that
can do that.
I know. I was going to say now it is taking into account things like guys who think they should be women, right? The DNA is taking account
then
of
then
that.
there's that aspect of it. I mean,
I'm just
which
curious. I mean, I'm just wondering how the DNA does that. I don't know.
well, and here's the sad. Well, I don't know if it's sad, but the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what you do to your body in terms of its appearance or what kind of hormones you take to try and imitate or mimic the opposite sex. Um, every single cell in your body is either male or female. And that's not going to change.
Wow, the hate that comes from DNA. Just the hate. Only two genders?
Sorry. I mean, but that's a hard fact. And I say that not to condemn. I have good friends, dear friends, who are experiencing transgenderism. And it's a hard thing. And I have all the care and love that I can muster, that I have for these people. I really do care about them. And I don't have answers for them, but the, the fact, the sad fact for transgenders is you really you can't change your structural cellular DNA makeup. You just
No,
can't.
no. If you're born a guy, you're always a guy. There's no way around that.
So
What it is.
getting back to how evolution addresses DNA. Well, so it must have come, RNA must have somehow done it first, which led to DNA. This ancient RNA world, where nucleic acid would have been used for both uh, catalysis and genetics, may have influenced the evolution of the current genetic code based on 4 nucleotide bases. However, there is no direct evidence of ancient genetic systems, as recovery of DNA for most fossils is impossible because DNA survives in the environment for less than 1 million years. This is amazing. The oldest bit of DNA that has been sequenced thus far is over 1 million years old. It survives that long from a woolly mammoth. It's pretty crazy. We'll talk more about that. Here's my favorite part. Building blocks of DNA may have been formed extraterrestrially in outer space. Complex DNA and RNA organic compounds of life, including uracil, blah, 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 have also been formed in the laboratory under conditions mimicking those found in outer space, using starting chemicals such as pyrimidine found in meteorites.
Okay, so I'm going to put forward a crazy idea. So let's just say there was this all omnipotent being who then placed another individual in someplace, I don't know, like a garden. Is that what they mean by extraterrestrial?
This is what I think is funny. I mean, you read the rest of the article and it's highly scientific and very technical. Then you read these 2 paragraphs and they're just dumb. They're dumb. We've just read about the incalculable complexities of how the cell reproduces, how it even operates, and
Right.
how it the complexity of it and the interconnectedness of all of those systems is so mind-boggling. You know, a mechanical engineer would take a week to get that all figured out.
Yeah.
Um, it's so mind-boggling that that couldn't self-assemble
No.
statistically, and this is a fact. Statistically, that those all of those billions of bits should come together in and of themselves to produce complex life forms like us is statistically impossible.
Absolutely.
That's not an exaggeration. No matter, it doesn't, 4.5 billion years wouldn't even come close.
Right.
You give it an infinite amount of time, it's not going to happen. Sorry. Anyway, so, and they admit that right off the bat. Well, then maybe it was RNA. Then realizing that that couldn't happen on Earth too. Well, maybe it happened in outer space. Let's kick the can down the road. That's how it happened. I mean, that's desperate.
It is
That's
desperate, right?
for a
Because
football game. It would be a punt. You know. Anyway, I thought you'd appreciate
no,
that.
I do because it's like, hey, we might have this possible explanation in this dusty old book, and they're like, nah, get that out of here. The aliens did it. That's what did it.
And it was in Darwin's era. It was easy for him to come up with that theory of human evolution because they did not have any knowledge of the cellular structure
Right.
of microbiology. They didn't know any of that stuff. The molecular biologists are looking at this and going, no, there's no way. All right. DNA profiling. Forensic scientists now can use DNA in blood, semen, skin, saliva, or hair found at a crime scene to identify a matching DNA of an individual such as a perpetrator. First time in 1986. This process is formally termed DNA profiling, also called DNA fingerprinting.
And may I also add, it made for great TV when Maury Povich would say with 99.9% certainty, you are or are not the father. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it did give us that gem. So,
Well, we'll get to that. So DNA profiling is also used successfully to positively identify victims of mass casualty incidents like
hmm.
the Twin Towers. DNA profiling is also used in DNA paternity testing. Pardon my asthma.
It's all good.
The probability of parentage is typically 99.99%. That's how accurate it is. But here's where the Book of Mormon comes into this discussion. Because DNA collects mutations over time, which are then inherited, it contains historical information. And by comparing DNA sequences, geneticists can infer the evolutionary history of organisms, their phylogeny, their physical traits. This can be used in studies ranging from ecological genetics to anthropology. Human migration, genealogical DNA testing methods have been used on a longer timescale to trace human migratory patterns. For example, they determined when the first humans came to North America and what path they followed. And we'll
Wow.
talk. Now, the science of that is not finished. It probably never will be
Right.
in this life. But what we have is fascinating. For several years, researchers and laboratories from around the world sampled indigenous populations from around the globe in an effort to map historical human migration patterns. The National Geographic Society's Genographic Project aims to map historical human migration patterns by collecting and analyzing DNA samples from over 100,000 people across 5 continents. You want to see the map?
Yeah, I do.
There you go. It looks like a quilt.
Okay.
They categorize these DNA traits into groups called haplogroups, HAPLO,
Yep.
haplogroups. And they label them with the letters of the alphabet, starting with A. And the further into the alphabet you get, the closer to our time it becomes. So haplogroups B and C are derived from haplogroup A, the original haplogroup,
Okay.
getting down to like Z. Now, what you will notice, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, is that the Western Hemisphere looks less like a patchwork quilt than the Old
Right.
World.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, the South, Central, and North America, with the exception of Canada, Alaska, is essentially one haplogroup, Q. So what it's called. So we'll get to that. But that I could stare at this for hours, just consider especially the biblical history and that sort of thing about what's going on here.
So Ken, let me ask you this. Have they found a way to um date DNA? Right?
Oh
Um
yeah,
because I would be interested. Obviously, there's some mass migrations we're well aware of, right? The settling of the
correct.
New World. That's pretty easy to go, okay, this happened here, and then we see this influx here. But anciently, can they date that DNA to say, okay, it's sometime between this date and this date?
Yes, yeah, very precisely. Which
Okay.
is why you'll notice, like, just look at the Americas. Again, we'll talk in more detail later on. In the Americas, you'll see the predominance of two haplotypes, haplotype C, C3,
Hmm.
and haplotype Q3.
Okay.
All right. They happened at different times. C came first, they're the progenitors, and then Q happened. Most currently believe that the New World or the Western Hemisphere, um, the American continent, was populated in 3 waves. And I'll just let you stew on that for a minute while we'll come back to it. But let's
Let,
let's
let,
get on with.
Can
Yes.
I ask one more question about this map? So
Sure.
where they're mapping, we'll just look at the New World here. We look at Q3 and like Q C10 and that sort. Are those native populations or are those the populations living there today?
Those are the indigenous, the native
Okay.
populations.
Okay.
Yeah, this is pre-European colonization,
Okay.
which that's what they're trying to do is determine the origin of these indigenous groups, which is really it is the coolest thing ever to see them do this. You know,
Yeah.
right or wrong, I would totally do this. I mean, just to see, right? All right, let's go on. So here begins our story of the genesis, the beginning of this straw man argument that people use to disprove the Book of Mormon. And this is the argument. The understanding of Joseph Smith and of traditional Mormonism is that Book of Mormon reveals that some American Indians are descendants of the Lamanites, who descended from Lehi and are therefore a remnant of the house of Israel. So far, so good.
Yep.
Mormon researchers, such as anthropologist Thomas Murphy, and I'll point out here, we'll talk about him in more detail, but he's not a practicing Latter-day Saint.
No.
Yeah, he hasn't been doing it for a couple of
Quite a few
decades.
years, yeah.
And ex-Mormon plant geneticist Simon Southerton state that the substantial collection of Native American genetic markers now available are not consistent with any detectable presence of ancestors from the ancient Middle East. They have argued that this poses substantial evidence to contradict the account of the Book of Mormon. And they have both come out and said essentially that Joseph Smith is a fraud and that the Book of Mormon is a fake
Right.
based on that. And we'll just say right now uh, that the vast majority of Native American um, indigenous DNA is Asian, Asian, right?
Which includes the Middle East, right?
No, no,
No?
but we'll talk about that too because there is that. We'll get to that after all this, but no, we're like East Asian. That's what we're talking
Okay,
about.
East Asian. Okay.
And I have to tell you, my understanding is that Native Americans don't like that. I think I could understand, but yeah, it's
Okay.
Asian DNA. Um, yeah, we'll get. So this is Thomas, born in 67, earned his PhD in anthropology at the University of Washington in 2003. His dissertation was this study about the Lamanites and trying to find this. And they're both nice guys. I mean, they're not out there starting fires. I mean, they have hit back because there have been some insensitive Mormons who kind of come after them. And
Sure.
but even and they've both been on John Dalen's Mormon Stories podcast, and they're humble about it. They're not trying to pick fight. They're just trying to live their lives. And I empathize with them. If I were an anthropologist or a genetic scientist, and I saw an opportunity to double check the Book of Mormon claims, I would have jumped at that chance, just like they did. And I don't have any issues with their findings. I think their findings are accurate. And not necessarily their findings, but findings of others. And it has been confirmed over the decades since they first published in 2003 and 2004. What I take issue with and what we'll talk about tonight is the application of what has been found, number one, and number two, the premise for the study,
Okay.
which is the straw man,
Right.
right? And then, of course, as professionals, they should also recognize the limitations of the study that they were trying to do. And we'll talk more about that. So um, his dissertation came out first, and then he published his book, Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. He posited that DNA evidence suggests that Native Americans are descendants of individuals from northeastern Siberia. And we know more that it's more Asian than that now, corroborating conclusions that anthropologists have long held. So that's his story. He writes that DNA and other research contradicts numerous LDS doctrinal claims, such as Native Americans are descended from Middle Eastern people. And there's his first error. Native Americans are descended from Middle Eastern people who immigrated to the Americas in 600 BC. Is that what the Book of Mormon teaches?
Well,
No.
doesn't it say that in the title page that the Lamanites were of the seed of Lehi, who came out of the Middle East, right?
In 1981, excuse me, in the introduction, the Book of Mormon, which was written in 1981, which is not a part of the gold plates, Bruce McConkie, or someone under his direction, wrote that the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. In light of this discovery, that was changed in the early 2000s to read that the Lamanites are among the ancestors of the Native Americans. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll talk about that too. So he has likened the Book of Mormon to inspirational fiction. It's a fraud. His view of genetic research was expanded upon by molecular biologist Simon Southerton, a former Mormon bishop, with his study, Losing a Lost Tribe Native American DNA in the Mormon Church, published in 2004. Mormon scholars and concessions by geneticists from BYU. Let's see. Accounting the current status of Native Americans in context of national studies. Other researchers like Scott Woodward from BYU, who's a geneticist, are critical of Southerton's work, and we'll talk about those. But that's Thomas Murphy's story. So far, so good?
Yep.
So his stake president asked him to recant his position or to resign from the church. He declined to do both. So they were going to call a council to disfellowship or excommunicate him. It received widespread attention, and less than 24 hours before the scheduled meeting where he would be excommunicated or disfellowshipped, they indefinitely postponed his disciplinary council. So he's still a member of record, even though he doesn't believe it and hasn't attended it. And he really, I mean, you watch the interview, he really seems like a nice and a thoughtful guy. So there's a Simon Southerton. He was a member of the church, converted at age 10. He was a bishop in Melbourne, and he tells a story. While he was bishop, he woke up one morning and didn't believe it anymore after pondering some of this stuff. He resigned as bishop in 98, left the church. After his book was published, the church charged him with apostasy. Southerton stated that he was, and this is neither here nor there, but he was excommunicated for being too vocal regarding the results of the genomics project DNA. However, those who attended his disciplinary council contended that the excommunication had nothing to do with the book. In an interview with Mormon podcast host John Dehlin, Southerton explained that he was prevented from talking about his position regarding the DNA evidence in connection with the Book of Mormon, and clarified that the excommunication was not for adultery, but rather for inappropriate relations with a woman during a period of time he was separated from his wife. This was after he had left the church, and his wife left with him, although a little delayed from him. I'm pleased to say that they have been happily married 15 years since, so I'm glad that they're happy together, according to him. Anyway, so that's his story. And for those of you who want more information, his book, by the way, doesn't talk just about DNA. Again, because I think he clearly felt offended by the reaction of many Latter-day Saints, for him attacking their faith through this DNA thing. He actually wrote a book. His book looks a lot more like the CES letter than it does a scientific book about DNA.
Oh, okay.
DNA is only a single chapter of multiple chapters of criticisms about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Anyway, so what Fair Latter-day Saints has done, and you can see the summary of claims here, and they do this with these anti-Mormon works that make this donut. 14% of his book is fact, 36% is spin, 30% are mistakes, and 20% are flat out falsehoods of the book.
Ooh.
And they refute his book line by line. I mean, it's a law. But if anybody wants to look at that, you can find it on Fair Latter-day Saints. And there's the website I list here. Or just look up Simon G. Southerton and it'll take you to that refutation page. Kevin Barney, who sits on the board of FAIR and other places, he's an attorney, practicing attorney in Chicago. He paints with a broad brush, but I think he kind of characterizes what's happening with these two guys here. He says, Murphy and Southerton appear to be nice guys. I would agree. They are sincere and they believe in what they're doing. Both seem to have had a similar experience. They apparently grew up with narrow, what I would call more binary, simple assumptions about the Book of Mormon,
Right.
believing in and presumably knowing only of the hemispheric model, which prior to the 1980s, nobody knew anything really about ancient America. We were all flying blind. We were all ignorant. And everybody who reads the Book of Mormon for the first time thinks the narrow neck of land is Panama, the land of the first inheritance is South America, and the land northward is North America.
Hmm.
Until you realize there's no way that Alma could traverse, what
Right.
is that, 2,000 miles in a month. You know what I mean?
Dude was
And other
cooking.
things. So the hemispheric model, I mean, everybody kind of believed in it. And uh, fortunately, the church itself never took an official position. We'll read about that too. But when they learned that the hemispheric model was scientifically untenable, each experienced unfulfilled expectations and an ensuing crisis of faith, upon which each lost his belief in the antiquity and historicity of the Book of Mormon and the church with it. Now they desire to enlighten others under the banner of science.
Hmm.
And that's when the church, in an effort to protect the membership, if practicing members are using the church to fight against the church, that's when they have to be cut off and excommunicated. Any questions about that? It's kind of a simple uh, illustration of what's going on with these guys.
Hmm.
And I can't blame them if that
Right.
was my belief and understanding. Fortunately for me and others like me, we had a more complete, nuanced, archaeologically based understanding of ancient America before these DNA studies came up.
Right.
Does the Book of Mormon teach that all Native Americans are descended from Lehites?
No, not in my opinion. Not I look, I know I'm gonna piss certain people off, and I'm kind of used to that here. But I don't think that North America or South America, wherever they landed, was uninhabited, right? I don't believe that for a minute. I think there were already people here, and um, therefore to say that all descendants, all Native Americans are descendants of Lehi just wouldn't hold water.
However, do you think many in the church actually believe that?
I think there's some that definitely do believe that. Yeah,
I think most did. I think I was one of them because in the 1970s, what did we know?
right,
We had no internet, and we certainly didn't have the view of ancient American society and culture that we have today. All I had was the Book of Mormon, who talked about these people peopling the Americas and having these populations in the millions. And
right,
so you can see why people would come up, make up these great stories about how the Nephites, the Lamanites were everywhere.
right.
Um, so here's Dr. John Sorensen. He was the chair and founder of the anthropology department at Brigham Young University. I think history will look at this man and recognize him as being underappreciated, undercelebrated. 20 years. What I'm going to quote him saying, he said 20 years before Southerton and Murphy published their DNA stuff.
Okay.
20 years. 1984, he said, one problem some Latter-day Saint writers and lecturers have had is confusing the actual text of the Book of Mormon with the traditional interpretation of it. The Book of Mormon explicitly, clearly teaches, unmistakably teaches, that at least two other groups of people had arrived on the American continent before Lehi. There were already people here.
The
Now,
Mulekites were
especially,
one, right?
but
The Mulekites would have been one.
that's right. But the other and the most significant, who arrived 2,000 years almost before Lehi, were the Jaredites.
Hmm.
And we forget them. They're just in this one book.
Right.
But they arrived right after the Tower of Babel, shortly after the flood, between 2500 and 2200 BC. They
Yeah.
had 2,000 years to roam this continent and to settle. And yes, the capital of their society killed each other, but that by no means suggests that everybody who ever came over 2,000 years ago was dead,
No.
right? There's no way they could possibly know that, right? In any case, so I love what Sorensen says. They confuse the actual text with traditional interpretation. The traditional interpretation of some is that all Native Americans are Lamanites. In fact,
Right.
the early brethren, including Joseph Smith, routinely referred to Native Americans as Lamanites,
Sure.
right? Which genetically is not true. But in terms of being Native Americans, they just use those terms interchangeably. He goes on, for example, a commonly heard statement is that the Book of Mormon is the history of the American Indians. Is it? He says this statement contains a number of unexamined assumptions. That the scripture is a history is the common sense, a systematic chronological account of main events in the past of a nation or territory, that the American Indians are a unitary population, and that the approximately 100 pages of text containing historical and cultural material in the scripture could conceivably tell the entire history of a hemisphere, he says sarcastically.
Gotcha.
It's
When
not, it's no, it's not
when he
possible.
when he's talking about a unitary population, he's
Right,
talking about a population that is the same, right?
right.
Okay.
One solid unitary population. That is simply not true. Um, he goes on, here's the significant point for me. When unexamined assumptions like these are made, critics respond in kind. He was prophesying here. Critics respond in kind, criticizing not the ancient text itself, but the assumptions that we have made. So
Okay.
20 years before Southerton and Murphy did this, he prophesied that it was going to happen.
Right.
And that's exactly what they've done.
Right.
They didn't attack what the Book of Mormon text is telling us. They attacked what many of us had come to believe.
I think you bring up a good point here, and I forgive me, I'm slow, but I'm going to try to restate what you said here.
We're going to be doing this a lot because it is complicated.
So basically, a lot of times what this DNA is pointing out isn't falsehoods within the Book of Mormon, but maybe falsehoods about what we believed the Book of Mormon was saying.
Agreed. That's
Okay.
exactly right. That's exactly right. Um, so going on here, does the Book of Mormon teach that the Lehites were the only people in the New World?
No.
No, we've talked about this. The Book of Mormon explicitly records that there were already people in the Americas when Lehi arrived, and some had been here for nearly 2,000 years prior. That's twice as long as the Nephites existed on the continent.
Right.
The church has never taught that the Nephite civilization was Pan American.
Right.
At least as early as 1929, Anthony Ivins, a member of the First Presidency, prophetically stated the Book of Mormon teaches the history of three distinct peoples, or two peoples and three different colonies of people who came from the old world to this continent. It does not tell us that there was no one here before them. It does not tell us that people did not come after. And so, if discoveries are made which suggest differences in race origins, it can very easily be accounted for and reasonably, for we do believe that other people came to this continent.
Okay.
That's pretty good, 1929, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So and we'll talk about the implications of that and the implications of what the DNA really is saying.
Okay.
But now we need to take a step back and look at the limitations of historical DNA analyses.
Okay.
This is Terrell Givens commenting on this. Quite simply, DNA would be a relevant tool in the debate only if a number of extraordinary conditions were present. The science can get quite complicated, but the assumptions on which it is based are not. As Michael Whiting, a molecular biologist and member of a scientific review panel for the National Science Foundation, points out, at least 10 factors make the hypothesis of American Indian Israelite connections untestable, period.
Hmm.
You can't really test it. Number one, among these are the unlikelihood of the Book of Mormon peoples remaining genetically uncontaminated by any other peoples during their 1,000-year presence in this hemisphere.
Time out. I'm gonna interject something here. Make sure I'm understanding. When he says uncontaminated, is he talking about like cross crossbreeding, if you will, with
Right, intermarrying, yeah, sharing DNA.
intermarrying is a better way.
And the Book of Mormon explicitly teaches that.
Yes. Yep.
That
And
at the
so
time of Christ's coming, there were no ites. They
yeah,
were all one.
right. And so if that's the case, right, then that answers another question. In engineering, specifically civil engineering, there's an old adage that the solution to pollution is dilution, right? Um,
Hmm,
and so is there such thing as diluting DNA, so to speak, right? So
absolutely. Yeah.
over time, with all the intermarrying that's going on between Lehi seed and Mulek, the people of Mulek and the Jaredites, if they are intermarrying with other indigenous tribes, we would expect then to see, if I'm understanding correctly, that you're not going to get a pristine sample, so to speak,
That's
of
that's exactly
Israeli
true.
DNA, right?
And that is only the tip of this iceberg.
Okay.
Okay. Goes on. One would also have to ignore the effects of genetic contamination among indigenous populations that doubtless occurred in the 15th centuries after Book of Mormon history ends.
Okay.
Okay, so the Book of Mormon history ends 400 AD. That's another 1100 years before the Europeans show up. I mean, it's not going to remain pristine over that time either.
Okay.
Thirdly, one would also have to know precisely who among the vast American Indian populations of today are the descendants of what the Book of Mormon calls Lamanites. The very small size of the founding genetic pools and the shifting genetic identity of the Middle Eastern host population also present challenges to experimental validation, meaning, how do we know what 600 BC Middle Eastern DNA looked like?
Okay. That's a good point. Yeah.
Talk about talk about genetic mixing. I mean, the Middle East has just been this campaign sweeping through it. I mean, for 3,000 years,
Right.
2,600 years.
Well, just
Now
just
here's the other. Here's Go ahead.
I was going to say, just think about it in the last 100 years, right? You
Yeah,
have you have the Jews going back to Israel, right? And most of them would have been classified as probably European at that point
right.
because they're coming out of Europe and there's been
Yep,
connections and intermarrying, and so now
yep,
they're introduced back into the Holy Land, and
yep.
yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that's probably the single. Well, they're all insurmountable problems. Now here's what no one is really talking about, which is something that really should be considered. Was Lehi Jewish? He was not. The Book of Alma states that he was from the tribe of Manasseh,
Okay,
one of the lost 10 tribes. We have no record of what that DNA might look like, which is especially important because Manasseh and Ephraim would have had the most distinctive DNA of all of the tribes of Israel because of their mother.
right,
Their father was Joseph, their mother was Egyptian. Not only was she Egyptian, Hugh Nibley believed she was her father was of the priest class. Hugh Nibley suggests that the priest class in Egypt were black. So, right? So
right.
if the northern 10 tribes had already been carried away, what was Lehi doing in Jerusalem? Well, of course, he had fled. well, or his predecessors had fled to escape that, right? So he
Okay.
had a home in Jerusalem and he had an ancestral home up further north
Okay.
of Jerusalem. But that's also significant. He's not Jewish. He's not of the tribe of Levi, so he's not a Cohen. It could, even if they had a pure genetic line of the tribe of Judah or of the tribe of Levi, it wouldn't necessarily apply. In fact, it
Right.
would be quite distinct because of Asenath, Joseph's wife.
Okay, so just for a second, let's break this down a little further because I think this is super important. Because when you start talking about Judaism, I do believe at some point there was a bloodline, obviously. I believe that there still is, a little bit of that's ethnocentric, right? If you will. And then
Okay.
there is kind of the cultural aspects of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like you would see people, because there are converts into Judaism, right?
Correct.
And so Lehi, by every sense of the word, could be a practicing Jew, but not necessarily of Israelite lineage. Is that kind
Right.
of
Well,
understanding?
okay. So he is Israelite because he's one of the 12 tribes,
Right,
and he practices Judaism, which is the name of those who worship Yahweh,
right.
right? But he is of the tribe of Manasseh. He's Israelite, but he's not Jewish.
Okay, Israelite, but not
Jewish is the tribe of Judah.
okay. But he would have still, because in the Book of Mormon it talks about him keeping those customs, right? He offers sacrifices in the desert
Correct.
and all those things.
Correct.
Okay.
Anyway, and I
This
don't know if
gets
this is what you're mentioning
complex.
earlier,
Like
but
we're about a half hour in, and my mind's already blown a little bit here, right? Breaking down the complexity of this.
it gets much worse or better. Pictures and everything, but um, I would be completely and utterly surprised if there were a single human being alive today that was of an uncontaminated lineage. I,
Right.
I don't believe that's possible over thousands of years. Yeah, especially in the world today. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's just the way it is. On the other hand, we're all descendants of Charlemagne.
Right.
We don't
Yeah.
have any of his DNA, but in terms of genealogy, yeah, we're all related to him. In that sense, Native Americans are probably all descendants of Lehi.
Well, yeah, because then you look at the whole intermarrying thing and you realize it kind of goes both ways, right? So while
Well,
Lehi's
look, his sons, Laman and Lemuel,
right.
most likely intermarried and recruited from the native populations, which would explain why they continually outnumbered the Nephites
Yeah.
and why they ended up why they're generated within a generation, their kids would have darker skins,
Well,
the
and
skins of the natives.
yeah, and then also I think this is maybe an important point here. If it's not, you can correct me. But we don't know what Native American DNA looked like before Lehi would have been there, right?
Well, I think we do, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
Now, here's the cool thing. Simon Southerton, the guy who wrote the book in 2004, claiming the Book of Mormon was a fraud because of this, in 2005 said this, and I quote, in 600 BC, which was when Lehi arrived, there were probably several million American Indians living in the Americas. Now, since that time, because of LIDAR discoveries, that number has been revised upward by a factor of at least 10.
Right.
There were hundreds of millions of Native Americans. He goes on, if a small group of Israelites entered such a massive native population, it would be very, very hard to detect their genes 200, 2,000, or even 20,000 years later.
Okay, I'm not going to put words in your mouth. This comes from me. So if he makes this admission here, then
Yep.
to me, and fine, however you want to get through it, that I'm fine with you doing whatever you need to do. But I just ask that you be honest and not drag people with you. To me, if you're basing your sole testimony on the absence of DNA in the Book of Mormon, but then you make an admission from a scientific point of view here, just call it what it is. You probably wanted out and you needed a way to get out, and this is a good door.
Who could say? I'll tell you from his book, though, his issues are far more complicated than just the DNA issue.
Right.
I mean, it's the CES letter type stuff,
Right.
you know. So, like the Book of Abraham, you really relies heavily on that, and you and I have discussed that
Yeah.
until midnight. But so here's Wikipedia here. Defenders of the Book of Mormon have made arguments that center on the idea that Book of Mormon peoples from the Middle East formed only a small portion of the population of the Americas. Okay. Now,
Okay.
people say the limited geography model was made in response to this DNA attack. But as I'll show you, that model was, well, and it says here in the quote, that model was put forth in 1984 by
Right.
John Sorensen in the enzyme. And their genetic heritage may have been diluted beyond what can now be detected. The limited geography model of the Book of Mormon supports this position. This geographical and population model was formally published in an official LDS magazine, The Ensign, in a two-part series published in September and October 1984, and anybody can read it for free online. Yeah.
Hmm.
People, when they talk about John Sorensen, someone once described him as that he inhaled the Book of Mormon. That guy, and I knew people who were his home teachers,
Right.
talk about intimidated. That guy, he he knew the Book of Mormon so well, inside and out, and probably had all 600 geographical references in the Book of Mormon memorized. His work, stunning. Up until the point that he died a few years back. But an early American setting for the Book of Mormon, an ancient American setting for the Book of Mormon, came about in the early 1980s. He was so far ahead of everybody. We're still catching up to him. Here's the other issue. It's called a population bottleneck, which is the loss of genetic variation that occurs when a natural disaster, epidemic, disease, massive war, or other calamity results in the death of a substantial part of a population. These events may severely reduce or totally eliminate certain genetic profiles. In such cases, a population may regain genetic diversity over time through mutation, but much of the diversity that previously existed is irretrievably lost. Could
Hmm.
we think of any of those circumstances regarding the Native Americans?
Well, if you follow the Book of Mormon, the Nephites sure did dwindle in numbers, right? So yeah, you would expect with that kind of war that whittles a population down that much, that's the perfect environment here that I think is being talked about.
Yeah, the term for that is called genocide. The Nephites were extinguished,
Right.
hunted down, even after the record was finished. Of course, we know that 400 years earlier, they were all one. When they began to distinguish themselves as Nephites and Lamanites after that, it had nothing to do with their lineage.
Right.
It had to do with, are you a believer or are you a non-believer?
Right.
You're right. That's how it started. But still, that's a significant calamity happening to that population. In addition to the catastrophic war at the end of the Book of Mormon, the European conquest of the Americas in the 15th, 16th centuries touched off just such a cataclysmic chain of events.
Right.
As a result of war and the spread of disease, many Native American groups experienced devastating population losses. One molecular anthropologist observed that the conquest squeezed the entire Amerindian population through a genetic bottleneck.
Wow.
He concluded this population reduction has forever altered the genetics of the surviving groups, thus complicating any attempts at reconstructing the pre-Columbian genetic structure of most New World groups.
Hmm.
Approximately, now this is the crazy part, approximately 90% of the Amerindian population died out following contact with Europeans.
Ooh.
Most, most of this was due to infectious disease against which they had no defense. It may be that eliminating 90% of the pre-contact gene pool has significantly distorted the true genetic picture of Lehi's descendants.
Yeah.
From this fact alone, population bottleneck, it is impossible. I mean, let's say by the time the Europeans got here, there were still a little bit, we might have had some Manasseh DNA in there somewhere.
Right.
After 90% is wiped out, they're gone. There's no way that that would survive that.
Right.
Any questions about that?
Nope. No, I think that's pretty clear.
So this is going back to the change to the introduction of the Book of Mormon. And I think Thomas Murphy, the first author, takes pride in the fact that he feels like he made the church do this. And he's not wrong. Here's the interesting thing. Even though it was devastating to their own faith journey, what they did has taught us about our own Book of Mormon,
Right.
made it richer and better and more accurate, our understanding of it, right? Without disproving it as they would like to have everybody believe. And we'll talk about why that is. When the introduction of Book of Mormon was penned in 1981 under McConkie's direction or by him personally, it reflected the popular view that the Book of Mormon was about the origins of Native Americans across the whole hemisphere, and that ancient Lamanites were the primary ancestors of modern Native Americans. The updated version will add one word that makes the introduction a more accurate statement of what the text itself says or doesn't say. The word is among. Now, the Lamanites are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Bravo. This word corrects that 1981 assumption, actually an old assumption dating to the earliest days of the church about the scope of the text. It is not a correction of any doctrine or principle taught in the Book of Mormon itself. This author goes on, I'm proud of a church that can recognize the limitations of men, past and present, and take advantage of advances in knowledge. I'm pleased that improved understanding has allowed old, but possibly sloppy assumptions to be revisited and substantially improved through the use of the word among to more accurately reflect what the text actually requires. This change in the introduction should be applauded. That's what he said. And I agree with him 100%.
As many of you know, a few weeks back, Robert Lefevre passed away. Now, Robert left quite a footprint in Mormon fundamentalism. He is responsible for helping hundreds, if not thousands, of independent Mormon fundamentalists get their ordinances. As well, Robert, I know for a fact, has helped out two separate groups of Mormon fundamentalists with getting their ordinances. Now, we all know funerals can be expensive, and Robert's family's in need of some help with those costs. So if you go to this episode's show notes, you'll see that there's a GoFundMe page link. Click on that link and let's help this family out. Look, these times that come along every so often, these are times that we get to show not just the world, but also our Heavenly Father that we're willing to take care of His children. So again, go to this episode's show notes, click that link, and make a donation today. Thank you.
Want more from the Mormon Renegade podcast? Head over to the Mormon Renegade Rumble page to see all the videos from the podcast and the fundamental news program for free. Still not enough? Then join the Mormon Renegade Locals page by clicking the red join button, and for $5 a month, you can have access to podcast transcripts, Renegade exclusives, as well as weekly live stream show with the host Dave Sanders. Click the link in this episode's show notes today.
The church made the change in wording to the introduction of the Book of Mormon to remove the assumption, which inserted into the Book of Mormon introduction in the 1920s and not part of the original text, that all of the inhabitants of the Americas were exclusive descendants of Lehi. This had been the generally held belief from the time the church was restored. And why wouldn't it be?
Right.
It was most information anybody had about ancient America. This chain makes the Book of Mormon introduction compatible with current DNA evidence and acknowledges the fact that Lehi's group likely intermingled with the native inhabitants of the American continents based upon current knowledge of the DNA composition of the inhabitants of the New World. There is substantial scientific evidence of habitation in the Americas for thousands of years prior to Lehi's arrival. If Lehi had any descendants among Amerindians, then after 2,600 years, all Amerindians would share Lehi as an ancestor, even though his DNA didn't survive. Even if, as is probable, the Lehite group was a small drop in a larger population ocean of pre-Columbian inhabitants, Lehi would have been an ancestor of virtually all modern-day Amerindians if any of his descendants married into the existing New World population.
Okay.
That's just genealogy at work.
Right.
So Oh, I love this. I wish everybody could see this photograph on this slide.
They can go to
That
Rumble. They can go to Rumble. They can see it.
I the Olmec, which most Latter-day Saint scholars associate with Jaredite civilization because their dates coincide exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The Olmec ancient American civilization predates the Maya. They're the progenitors,
Right.
and the capital of their culture was in southern Mexico. This and they we have very little of what they wrote, almost nothing, but we do have much of their artwork that remains. You know, those giant heads
Those
that you see
giant heads.
pictures of.
Yep.
All right, those were the Olmec. This is a mask, a stone mask, jadeite, made of jadeite, depicting a very accurate Olmec slash Jaredite face.
Wow.
It's gorgeous, and it's very, very accurate. I mean, it's like you're staring at the person, and they are clearly Asian.
Yeah.
I love that. According to the Book of Mormon, this is Wikipedia again. The Jaredites were a group of people that left the old world after the fall of the Tower of Babel. Some Mormon researchers believe that Jaredite survivors of the war that destroyed their civilization, as described in the Book of Ether, could be ancestors to some Native Americans. John Sorensen was saying that in 92. Some writers theorize that American Indians received their Asiatic genetic heritage from the Jaredites. That's a,
Interesting.
that's a Nibley taught in 1988. And on the slide, I have the sources there. This is what Ken Peterson personally believes. That when we say that Native Americans predominantly are Asian in terms of their DNA, that's a reflection of Jaredite ancestry.
Interesting. Okay.
And I'll tell you partly why I believe that.
Okay.
Partly because of this mask and other artwork like that. That the Olmec, whose chronology parallels that of the Jaredites almost exactly, um, were clearly Asian. I mean, judging by this mask and the rest of the artwork. So not only does their DNA point that out, but their physical aspects also are obviously Asian.
Now,
That
Ken.
that mask is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And let me finish this thought real quick. And where did the Jaredites come from? They
Did
were at the Tower of Babel.
right.
They prayed that they could stay together and keep their language unified. And then what did they do? They went east.
Okay.
And the Tower of Babel presumably was near Turkey. You go east from Turkey, where are you headed?
China.
That's right, into Asia, East
Yeah.
Asia. And they were probably not the only peoples to do that.
Right.
And who knows, they probably had people, sorry, they probably had people that were with them that stayed in Asia along the way while they continued on across the Pacific. Okay,
Right.
what were you going to say?
So there are pictures of Olmec heads that don't necessarily look like that mask, right?
Well,
If
they're a bit distorted. They're a bit fatter. I mean, they're just big fat heads, and
because as I looked at those heads, I was like maybe more Pacific Islanders, right? They
Well, which guess and guess what the DNA of Pacific Islanders is?
Asian,
Asian, Asian.
right? Yeah,
So that same genetic material would run right through that.
right, right.
This mask is stunning. I still, when I just stare at it and go, that it's like they're standing right in front of me. It's crazy. Genetic diversity and population structure in the American landmass is also measured using autosomal AtDNA microsatellite markers genotype, sampled from North, Central, and South America, and analyzed against similar data available from other indigenous populations worldwide. The indigenous American population show a lesser genetic diversity than populations from other continental regions, just like we saw on that map.
Right.
It's kind of a homogenous thing. Now, is that because they were the only people there predominantly, or is that because of genetic bottlenecking? All right, it could be some
Right.
of both. While their overall strongest affinity for other populations is observed for East Asian people, Observed is a decreasing genetic diversity as geographic distance from the Bering Strait occurs, as well as a decreasing genetic similarities to Siberian populations from Alaska. So the further south you go in the American continent, the more homogeneous it looks and the more different they are from the Siberian DNA. The overall pattern suggests that the Americas were colonized by a small number, I love this, by a small number of individuals, an effective size of about 70, which grew by many orders of magnitude over 800 to 1,000 years.
Ooh.
How
Oh,
many barges did the brother of Jared make shining stones for?
16.
I think it was 16 stones for 8 barges, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that good number 70 people.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? And
Wow.
they had 2,000 years to fill the
Right.
continent before Lehi showed up, and then another 2,000 years after that. According to a study from 2012, indigenous Americans descend from at least 3 main migrant waves from East Asia. Most of it is traced back to a single ancestral population called First Americans. However, those who speak Inuit languages from the Arctic inherited almost half of their ancestry from a second East Asian migrant wave. And those who speak Na-Dene inherited a tenth of their ancestry from a third migrant wave. The initial settling of the Americas was followed by a rapid expansion southwards along the West Coast, with little gene flow later, especially in South America. Here's what that looks like. So this is that same map we were looking at before, it's only showing the Native American DNA haplogroups.
Okay.
And the purple is haplogroup Q.
Okay.
And as you can see, as they were saying, as you proceed southward along the coast, you see that it just gets more and more purple.
Right.
Now, here's the interesting thing. The yellow color represents haplogroup C, which never really goes into the southern U.S., Central America, and South America. What this shows me, and I've read other articles that indicate that this haplogroup Q didn't expand northward, extreme northward at all, meaning that it's quite possible that they didn't go through Beringia, the Bering Strait, but that it was a trans-Pacific crossing, a transoceanic crossing. It would have to be Pacific because they were Asian
Right.
that brought them to the United States, and they spread southward and northward. And when I look at that map, that's what I see.
Right.
What does that describe? That describes the path of the Jaredites.
Okay. Because they went east, which would have took them through China. They would have hit the Pacific at some point and
Yep,
then made that journey across.
that's right. And landed. And if the center, the heart of civilization was southern Mexico, just north of the Yucatan, where their final battle occurred, um, that's presumably where they might have landed, on the
Okay.
west coast, southern Mexico. Anyway, I think it's beautiful. Now, regarding these 3 waves, haplogroup Q chronologically is the latest, so they would be the latest population to enter the Americas. Now this is going to go strictly according to LDS teachings. What was the previous group that inhabited the Americas prior to the Jaredites?
Would have been the Mulekites, right?
No, the Mulekites came just about the same time the Lehites did.
Okay. Okay.
Fall of Jerusalem. What group inhabited the Americas according to LDS teachings before the Jaredites? Adam and his
Right.
posterity.
I was going to say Adam and Eve, right? That's it.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Now, before that, they're going back to pre-Adamites, the Clovis people, the cavemen, right?
Right.
Those go back 12 to 18,000 years. In Ken Peterson's view, they are unrelated, even though I'll put that on pause. Um, and that there was the last extinction event on record, according to archaeologists, happened at 12,000 BC,
Mm-hmm.
right? At the end of the Ice Age. which destroyed many species like woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tiger. And my opinion is it probably did away with caveman. But Darwinians have to believe that they somehow survived and went on. And so they're trying to make this connection between that prehistoric DNA with our ancient DNA of the Jaredites and the posterity of Adam.
Well, and
So,
now I think even now Clovis first is under some duress, right? I mean, things keep getting a little bit older the more we look.
yeah, yeah, that's true. Well, we can talk about pre-Adamites all day long,
Right.
and and some of the things that implies. Why would we be surprised that other humanoids would have similar DNA to Adam?
Right.
Adam was not built from scratch. He was brought from another world.
Well,
And our humanoid species was created in the image and glory of God. So it's not like the DNA would get reinvented every single time.
or yeah, and if there's pre-Adamites and some of Adam's seed mixes with their seed,
Well, I see that's another possibility, one that I don't believe in. I believe that the earth was void and without form when Adam was placed upon it because it had been erased by the extinction event of the 12,000 BC to
right.
be prepared for this last creation that would fill the measure of its creation, as opposed to previous worlds on the earth that did not fill the measure of their creation and were destroyed to be made
Gotcha.
over again, ultimately in preparation for this great and last dispensation.
Okay. For everybody out
Amen.
there who right now is typing me a hot email telling me how badly I suck for just throwing ideas against the wall, just chill out. We're just talking some stuff here.
This for me, this is the fun part.
Yeah.
I mean, the stuff that we know is interesting, but the stuff that we don't know, but that we do have significant clues about, like this map, that blows my mind. I
Yep.
love that stuff. And you see the purple spot over in northern Russia. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, could that be a faction of the Jaredites that chose not to go across the Pacific?
Yeah.
And that's why their DNA, the Q haplogroup remained there. I love that. Love that stuff. Okay. So here's the world map again,
Can
showing all
can
of the, yeah.
I'm sorry, can you go back to that last slide for me real quick? Because I got a couple of observations here I want to spit at you real quick. So my thought is if there was a if there was a massive flux of migration from the one purple area to the Americas, why don't we see some sort of trail that goes through there? Right? I can't
Well, right,
imagine
right.
that these folks would be making that trek in a couple of days, right? I mean,
Well, what we have to take into account, the only population groups they studied are where you see those black dots.
okay.
For one reason, so because they didn't study population groups in those intervening areas, perhaps. If in fact they crossed over by the peninsula, by the Korean peninsula, they don't have any studies right there. Number two, we're talking about a distance of time of 4,500 years
So
or
dilution.
more. So who knows what could have happened in the meantime to
Okay,
erase
now
that.
you brought up something else, and I'm sorry, I keep asking questions here. So I'm
No, I
looking
love
at
your
this map.
questions.
I'm looking at this map, and I'm seeing where all the black dots are, and you say that's where they took samples from.
The studied populations is what it says on the key down at the lower right.
So how then if and forgive me, this is one of those things that I think is kind of important to figure out. So let's just look down there in South America, right?
Right.
They got a cluster almost in
Yeah.
the south and a cluster up in the northeast.
Right.
And then the entire west side, they just make the assumption then that that it's going to match what they sampled.
Yeah. Connecting the dots, coloring in the spaces.
Right. I guess, yeah, I
But at
guess.
the very end, I'm going to show you something else that will kind of blow at least one hole in that.
Okay. All right.
Again,
Because my
this
first
science
thought,
isn't perfect. The science isn't perfect. The science isn't finished.
okay.
But what we do know is pretty cool.
Okay.
At the very least, it's a good beginning. Yeah, all good questions. All right. So here we have the world map of all known haplogroup types, including the Qs. And there's the Cs, a much earlier haplogroup. And we see some of the Qs up where it showed on the other map.
Mm-hmm.
And over here near Turkey, what? By Caspian Sea?
Mm. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, remember when they left from
Yep.
Turkey, they built barges to cross an inner sea, which could have been
Right.
the Black or the Caspian.
Right.
So there's some of your tracings of where they were, right?
Yep.
Very interesting stuff to me, Asians. So let's pause here just for a second. So the primary issue that has caused many people to lose their testimony of the Book of Mormon and forsake the faith, and I've said this before, people who don't like being Latter-day Saints and who want to leave, I don't have any. I mean, not everybody has to be a Mormon,
Right.
and if it's not your thing, you don't need any excuse for me to leave the faith. And I hope we'll all still be friends and all that sort of thing. But the thing that breaks my heart are people who love being Latter-day Saints or Mormons, whatever you want to call us, and um, who with great sorrow divorce themselves from a faith that they love because of a supposed fact.
Right.
And it's for that reason that among others, that I love to engage in this stuff, to give people at least the other side of the story.
Right.
So the assumption is because the vast majority of Native American DNA is Asian and not Middle Eastern, the Book of Mormon is false. Okay. What we've demonstrated, number one, is the Book of Mormon itself has never taught that. What the Book of Mormon teaches directly, not tangentially, is that there was another race that preceded the Lehites by 2,500 years
Right.
who came from the east. We know that. And the archaeological remains of whom, if they are the Olmec, indicate that they're Asian. So that flips the whole argument. What the
Right.
DNA, Native American DNA, proves is the Book of Mormon is true. Because
Nice.
it shows the Jaredites were genuine and had come from the east, right?
Right.
And then to understand why we don't find even a single Semitic DNA there, you have to understand number one, they were from Manasseh. At
Right.
least half of their DNA came from an Egyptian, possibly black mother. So
Right.
it wouldn't look like Jewish DNA in any case. And then we have genetic drift, dilution, and bottleneck.
Mm.
Some of the worst examples in history we see in Native America.
Right.
So my dear friends who love being a Latter-day Saint, who lose sleep over this, please sleep well. The
Right.
Book of Mormon is accurate, and I'm grateful. Honestly, I'm grateful that Southerton and Murphy did these studies. I mean, their studies are only confirming what we're seeing on this map, that the
Right.
American population was homogenous, which also brings to mind the Book of Mormon scripture that the Lord has preserved this promised land, speaking of the Western Hemisphere. And you look in this map, or better yet, you look at this map, you can see what he was talking about,
Yeah.
where there were all kinds of people traversing the old world. The new world, we see basically one group of people. It wasn't nearly as acclaimed as the old world. It's kind of interesting in that perspective.
And I think this is one of those things where we need to really take a step back and understand the difference between exegesis and eisegesis, right? What we read into the scripture versus what it really says.
Yes, we don't
The
think about the Book of Mormon in those terms, and we really should.
the other thing that I will say is that we all come up with hypothesis, right? And
Yeah.
most of them aren't even stupid hypotheses. They're
Right,
just
right.
they're just the straightest line, and okay, this makes the most sense, and here they are, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes what these studies can do, right? Even though I think in the case of Southerton and the other guy, I'm blanking on his name now,
Murphy.
Murphy. Even though I disagree with their what this data means,
Hmm.
right? It should give us an opportunity to pause and reflect and say, okay, so what is it that I read into the scripture versus what the scripture actually tells me?
Yeah.
And there's certain things that we as Mormons all know, right? For the most part. And those things we know. Everything else, I think we have to start getting real comfortable with calling an idea, right?
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
and the things that are confirmed to you by the Spirit, go with those. Um, Everything else, you may want to make sure that you're not tying your faith to an unstable anchor.
Amen. Well said. That's exactly true. And speaking of Murphy and Southerton's work, I personally bear no grudge against them personally. And they seem like really likable people and sincere people. And the scientific results of their investigations, I don't disagree with that either. I mean, I agree. And it makes sense to me now from a more informed viewpoint of Native American archaeology and anthropology and history that, yeah, the majority of them are Asian. I don't have a problem with that at all. And that actually fits better with the Book of Mormon text than what may have been previously believed, right?
Right.
What I take issue with is the premise of their study
Mm-hmm.
that we would find significant remnants of Semitic Israelite DNA amongst the Native American populations. We discussed scientifically why that's probably never going to happen
Right.
because the population, the Lehigh population was a drop in this bucket.
Yeah.
And that's without bottleneck population issues,
Right.
but with bottleneck and genetic drift, that would be an impossibility. And so yeah, those are the only issues that I have. So and I've said this already, but I'm grateful for what they did. I mean, not to other people's testimonies, but that they brought this topic to light that we could learn more, and it helped me understand better and learn more about the Book of Mormon. Yeah,
Right.
and pre-Book of Mormon times for that matter. Which brings us to the secondary issue of Book of Mormon DNA, and that is the DNA claim of Rod Meldrum, who I also like. I'd like to meet him someday. Just, hey, we're Facebook friends though,
He's a great
so
guy. He's a great guy.
I believe that.
I had him on here a couple weeks ago, and he was absolutely a blast to have on. I would do
I,
it.
I I listened to that, and he sounds so fun.
He is.
He has an infectious laugh. It just sounds like
Yep.
such a good guy. So if you look at this diagram here, and this is not one that I made. This is taken off. If you go to Wikipedia and search for haplogroup X, this is what you find. And when you look at this and you realize what this is saying, you can absolutely understand why why Rod Meldrum is out of his mind excited about this. Haplogroup X, which is after Q, this is mitochondrial DNA from the mother side, showing that they were haplogroup X, guess where? The Middle East and in the Great
Great.
Lakes region. Not only would that substantiate Book of Mormon claims, it would substantiate Heartlander claims.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, he left something out. In his first quote, he's talking about subhaplogroup X2, and then he leaves those ellipses, dot, dot, dot. That's the problem. In the third paragraph, this is what he left out. I have in bold. The phylogeography of subclades of haplogroup X suggests that the Near East is the likely geographical source for the spread of subhaplogroup X2 in the Great Lakes regions, and the associated population dispersal occurred around or after the last glacial maximum when the climate ameliorated or improved. So what he left out is stating that that haplogroup X dates to 18,000 years ago.
Okay.
Final paragraph. So it is true that the American subgroup of X2 is related to the Middle East, but it is also clear that the American group broke off from that Middle East group around the time of the last glacial maximum, the point where the last ice ages glaciers reached their furthest southern extent about 18,000 years ago. This clearly means that the X2 haplogroup is unrelated completely to Lehi's group. How can a group from 18,000 years ago be related to a group from 2,600 years ago?
Sure. Let me ask you this. And again, I'm going to get blamed for questioning the science, but
hooray!
How certain are we that we can date this accurately?
I suppose there are always questions, and the dating, their carbon dating is one way. The genetic dating is done by turning the clock backwards. You can these mutations that identify one haplogroup from the other happen at intervals that can be calculated back in time. Is it foolproof 100%? Nobody can say.
Okay.
But it has proved thus far quite accurate. So I don't think it's, to answer your question, I don't think it's possible to answer it in 100%.
Sure.
That it's 100% accurate, but I don't have reason necessarily to doubt it at this point.
Okay. Okay, so the science is still unsettled for the most, it sounds like.
I wouldn't say it's unsettled. I would say it's the best we have, and it's reliable enough that we continue to utilize it. So, and now if the difference in time was 1,000 years or 2,000 years, I would be more inclined to accept this Rod's claim.
Okay.
But the fact that the difference between Lehi and this haplogroup X2 is 16,000 years, I mean, that's not even close. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's a harder thing to say.
Okay.
Still interesting though.
Yeah.
Who was a pre-Clovis population? Why were they at opposite sides of the world? I mean, who
Right.
would want to know that, right?
Yeah.
So we've told you about the main haplogroups that we know about and what science currently knows about them. Recently, there have been two what we call outliers, DNA outliers in ancient America. In November 2013, Nature published a discovery on an Upper-Paleolithic Siberian site linking Western Eurasians, so that would be like around Turkey and that sort of thing,
mm-hmm.
in the Middle East and Europe to the indigenous Native American population. What? So they could be that. Native Americans and Western Eurasia. Let's see. According to the study, the genome sequence showed distinct genetic markers that are unique to the indigenous Native Americans and Western Eurasia, but with no relation to East Asians. The study indicates that between 14 and 38% of Native American ancestry may originate through this gene flow. So now this upsets the apple cart again.
Right.
Is this what we've been looking for in terms of Middle Eastern DNA? Our findings are significant on two levels. First, it shows that Upper Paleolithic Siberians came from a cosmopolitan population of early modern humans that spread out of Africa to Europe and Central and South Asia. Second, Paleo-Indian skeletons like bull women with the phenotypic traits atypical of modern-day indigenous Americans can be explained as having a direct historical connection to Upper Paleolithic Siberia. So there's an outlier group, and it doesn't give us a good date. But what's interesting, study indicates that 14 to 38% of Native American ancestry may originate through that gene flow.
Wow. Holy cow. Go back to that one real quick. I got another question here.
Oh, that one right there.
This one here, and it's in that lower paragraph where it says first it shows that upper Paleolithic Siberians came from a cosmopolitan population of early American humans.
Of early modern humans that spread out of Africa to Europe and
Right.
Central and South Asia. Yeah, how would they know that? I don't
What
know.
are they are they
It,
using
it,
the word cosmopolitan the same way we use it, meaning
civilized.
civilized? So we're talking about a civilization, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I don't know how, and I wish there were more detail there, but is it because of the circumstances of finding the remains, clothing
Right.
and possessions, and who knows?
That was my question. What's making them say that this was a cohesive societal unit, so to speak?
That's a very good question. I wish I had the answer for you.
Okay.
This one's cool. In 2021, very recent, South Americans share ancestry with Oceanian populations that is not seen in Mesoamericans or North Americans. When I read that, I'm like, wow, things couldn't get more confusing. So there's a population, and you can see the color code, the dots, the burgundy and the red dots.
Right.
What are Australians and Indonesians doing in Central South America?
Right. Cool.
Of all the weird things.
Well,
So
and
clear.
then if you look like there's like one like way up over by India on the
Yeah,
coast,
yeah, yeah.
right? And it's like, okay, so how in the hell and do we have some sort of reference of time on this? Do we know how long this group has been in these
Yeah,
close
I'm
spots?
sorry. I don't have that. I'm sorry.
Ugh.
But isn't that
Yeah.
isn't that interesting? I mean, so clearly there are things happening in the world and in the Americas that the Book of Mormon has absolutely no knowledge of.
Well,
In
yeah,
fact,
and now we start talking about diffusion on a much larger scale,
yeah,
right? Now we start
yeah,
talking about diffusion happening in the Americas from all over.
yeah, yeah. Um, and this is a thing we need to point out about the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is only capable of telling us about the people around the authors,
Right,
what Nephi experienced, what Lehi experienced, what Jacob, what Alma experienced, right? What
right,
Mormon and Moroni experienced, what Mahanrai experienced, what Ether experienced, with some very rare exceptions, like in Third Nephi, when God tells them about the destructions to these other cities. How else would they know? You know,
right,
they don't have drones, they don't have satellites. How would they know? Because Jesus told them the cities in the north were buried, and the city was sunk, and Jerusalem was the city was swept out to the sea. Those sort of things, because God Himself was explaining to the Nephites what happened to these other cities, their destructions.
right.
That's otherwise they wouldn't have known. And that's an important thing for us to remember. The Book of Mormon is not a history of the Americas. It's not a history of the Native American peoples. It's not possible
It's a
for a
history
300
of
page book to do that.
it's a history of Lehi's people.
That's right. All right. Final photograph here or picture. This is taken from a mural that was painted on the archaeological structures in Chichen Itza, the Mayan population.
That's a little diverse. Um, yeah, you got some people who have darker skin, others who have way lighter skin. Yeah.
So just so we thought we figured everything out, I'm upsetting the apple cart again. So this is 1100 AD. So this is a good 700 years after the destruction of the Nephites, as accounted for in the Book of Mormon. And here we have, for whatever reason, different skin tones in these Mayan murals, these paintings. And in each case, the lighter skinned people are subservient. They're doing, they're paddling the boats, they're carrying the loads, they're doing those sorts of things. Isn't
Interesting.
that crazy? And here's another mural from that same structure in Chichen Itza.
Same thing.
Only in this case, the lighter skinned people are actually bound by or enslaved by the darker skin.
Whoa.
And only their faces, it would appear in some cases, are not black for the
Yeah.
darker skinned, which is a very recently discovered thing that ancient minds, before warfare, they would cover themselves in black,
Right.
which might have relationship to some of the scriptures referring to the
Yeah.
darkness.
And at this point, we don't know what this mural was, right? Was this
Right.
mural propaganda for another group? Was this mural trying to show a history? Because the dates don't necessarily, you couldn't look at the dates and then pair that and say, oh, well, they're telling the story as it happened. No, this is either propaganda or this is the
Could be their
retelling of a
history.
story. Yes.
Yeah. So to read this is a wall fresco on the Temple of the Warriors in Chichen Itza, Mexico, showing a major raid on a village near the sea. Note that the elite and commoner structures are being assaulted, with both male and female captives stripped and captured of the lighter skin tone.
Whew.
Anyway, that's all I got. That's all I
Dude,
have on that.
that's awesome. I'm gonna try to put a bow on this, so to speak, and you can tell me if I'm off base here.
Oh,
So
goody.
after looking at all of this, right? What we have Lehigh seed coming to the Americas, right? Wherever, take your pick, wherever you want to go, North or South America, and they aren't alone when they show up. There's
Correct.
already people here.
Yeah, there's a wonderful article. Um, none other than John Sorensen wrote a lengthy. Oh, here it is. When Lehi's party arrived in the land, did they find others there? And I give you the website that's a free download, and he goes into all of the textual suggestions that they were not alone. I mean, it
Right,
mentions the obvious. It teaches the Mulekites are already there, and the Jaredites have been there for 2,500 years, or 2,000 years, 1,900 years.
right.
So it's a delightful article, way ahead of
Yeah.
its time.
And so they're obviously not alone. There's probably indigenous populations here, right?
Yep,
Maybe even before the Jaredites, possibly.
possibly. You know what
Right?
Ken Peterson thinks? Do you care what Ken Peterson thinks about that?
I'm always care what Kim thinks.
If we believe that Noah's flood was worldwide, and you and I have talked about there is a mechanism by which that could happen,
Sure.
which would sweep the land masses clean without leaving everything submerged forever and killing all of the flora and fauna. It'd be a massive worldwide tsunami
Right.
triggered by an asteroid impact in the
Younger
northern polar regions, whatever. In any case, if that were true, North America would have been wiped clean of any previous inhabitants, which
right.
would have been the Adamites. You
Right.
know, the sons and daughters and the
The pre-Diluvian
the offspring of Adam and Eve.
yeah.
Uh, which is one reason. There are a couple of differences between the the Jaredite migration to the New World and the Lehite migration to the New World. The Jaredites had to build an ark like Noah's. It was built just like Noah, so it could be submersible. And not only did they have to bring seeds, they had to bring all these animals with them, and they had to bring bees with them. Why did they have to bring the desert? Why did they have to bring bees?
Pollination.
And and they also had to bring fresh fish, freshwater fish. They had to bring with them
Right.
because if what I'm thinking is true, possibly that the American continent had been swept clean by this tidal tsunami, it would have any freshwater fish would have been destroyed by the salinity of the tsunami. and it would have swept the continent clean of any bees, insects, and other life forms.
Right.
So any and all of the life forms that we have indigenous to the Americas today would have been those very things that the Jaredites would have of necessity brought with them: bees, trout, and that sort of thing.
Has there been any research done on that to
I
see
don't know.
if certain fish or certain insects come from certain regions?
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know.
that would be a trick.
But anyway, so Lehigh seed gets dropped in here, and because they intermarry with the locals who are already here,
Yeah,
we expect to see some sort of um, degradation, if you will. I hate using that term that way.
right.
I'm
It's not degradation, but a dilution of their
a dilution. Thank you.
gene pool. Yeah,
A dilution of their gene pool that way. Taking into account also that I think we may have been looking for the wrong thing, right? As you
yeah.
alluded to, Lehi's not Jewish, right? So we keep looking
No,
for Jewish DNA, whatever that looked like back
or
in.
even Levite, or even Israelite, and
Right,
of all the 12 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim are going to be the most distinct
right,
because of Asenet, the Egyptian.
right. And
The
so
mom.
we're looking for the wrong thing to begin with.
Right,
And then we have all this intermarrying going on. Now, having said that, if there is all this intermarrying happening, then if if there's even a drop of blood, so to speak, of Lehi running in any of these tribes, probably all of these tribes at this point, then aren't they all considered Lehi seed at that point? Isn't
right.
that the
Yeah.
promise?
Genealogically speaking, I mean, you and I don't have any of King Charlemagne's DNA in us. Doesn't change the fact that he's still our ancestor.
Right,
That's still true.
right, yeah,
DNA is not necessarily ancestry.
right, right. And so it feels to me almost like just looking for a smoking gun in DNA may not be a good way of saying it could be good supporting evidence, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I don't think it could ever be something where you could just say, okay, this rules out the historicity of the Book of Mormon now.
You know, no. If you wanted to play the naysayer, you could use that, and certainly people still do. But they're assuming the ignorance of the people they're debating with.
Right,
That we don't know better, that we don't know about bottleneck, that we don't know about genetic drift and genetic dilution over time, that we don't know about that stuff, or that we don't know that the Americas were completely. It looks like they were completely populated by people before Lehi ever even thought of going there, thousands of
right,
years. And that Lehi's little party of however many it was, what, 20 maybe,
right,
that drop in a bucket, 20 people amongst 100 million, you'd never find them again.
right, right.
Especially if they were all killed through genocide.
Well, and really, you can think of two massive bottlenecks within the Book of Mormon just right off the
Yeah,
top of my head, right?
yeah,
There's probably some sort of bottleneck when Christ comes back, right? That
yeah. That's true. That's true.
that level of destruction, I can't imagine because it says in the Book of Mormon that it basically takes care of all the wicked, right? Like,
Yeah,
boom,
yeah,
done, right? And that's why
yeah,
they
yeah,
have that 400 years
yeah.
of just peace and tranquility. So,
Well, at least 100 of them. The first 100 were great.
right, right, and so yeah, that's more accurate. You're right, but anyway, so there's a bottleneck that happens there, and then a few hundred years later, there's another significant bottleneck
Yeah, massive.
in that genocide. So gosh, I feel like we just went a long way to say, yeah, I wouldn't expect to see a smoking gun one way or another off of this.
Well, I mean, the truth is, and it sounds like a weak answer, is that in terms of DNA evidence, there's not enough information to test one way or the other for certain. That
No,
DNA can't possibly answer that question.
because
But
we really
but it's so
don't,
informative.
right. because the other thing I'm thinking, we don't know what Lehi's DNA would look like. We don't know what
No,
Ephraimite or Manasseh's DNA
no,
makeup would have looked like, right?
no,
So
no.
even if we did find it, we wouldn't know what we were staring at.
True, true. Very true indeed. Boy, what a fascinating study, though. DNA is quite a wonder. And the fact that we can make any sense of it at all is
Right.
endlessly fascinating. And the further back in history we go, the more interesting it becomes to me.
Yeah.
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 Who were these humans? What were they doing here?
Well, and then
That's
you
all
couple
fascinating to me.
yeah, and then you couple that with the fact of, like you were just showing, we got two sets of haplogroup X clear across the hemispheres from each other
Yeah.
18,000 years ago. Clo
What the heck? Yeah.
yeah, Clovis first doesn't seem to be a viable model much anymore now that things continue to get older, even within America, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we have all of this data now that's coming in, and for I feel like for a long time there was this idea through archaeology that hey, we've got this stuff all figured out, right?
Yeah.
That
It's just
really was it, right? Like we forget that archaeology is like just over 100 years old, right?
yeah.
And within 50 to 75 years, most of them went, yep, we got human history figured out.
Right, right.
And and that doesn't seem to be the case any longer.
It's
Um,
only getting it's only getting more and more complicated.
yep,
In one of
complicated,
our
older,
in in one of our previous discussions, and I looked this up because I kept finding articles about different species of humanoids,
right,
prior to the biblical Adam, right? And the
right.
two most famous would be, well, I mean, there's Homo sapien, and then there's, um, oh my gosh, I completely losing Denisovian
Right,
and Neanderthal, right?
right.
Completely different species that at one point we thought couldn't even interact or reproduce together. But now they think they kind of do. But those are only three of 23 known humanoid species. 23 different humanoid species. What in the heck was going on? It was
Well,
like this humanoid party for 300,000 years.
okay. So I'm going to make an admission now because some of my my critics will like. So here's your gift for me. It's an early Christmas. You get to use this on me. Because of some extenuating circumstances, I'm not real my genealogy is tough.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be fun to take one of those DNA tests.
Oh yeah.
And I'll be damned if some didn't come back like literally with like Neanderthal markers. Like,
Oh, you're awesome.
and I shared that with both Amber and Tanya, and they were like, that
Yep.
tracks. That makes sense. That tracks. Right. Like,
That's awesome.
but yeah, I'm so and yeah, like I said, I gave that just to my critics. There you go. Have fun with that. You can post all the stuff you want with that. But
Oh, that is so fun.
yeah, but and I want to say this too. We think we got some good capabilities now, but if there's anything that history has taught us when it comes to this kind of science is there's a good possibility somewhere in the future, if we last that long,
Right.
somebody might develop something else which completely overturns all of these models.
Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah, I
Right?
love when that
It,
happens.
10, 15 years down the road, someone could have, make a discovery at like, oh, that completely changes how we read all
Yeah,
of.
I'm not only open to that, I anticipate stuff like that.
Yes.
That's what keeps it interesting to me.
Yes. Whenever anybody says the science is settled, I tend to be like, no, it's not. That's the whole point of science. It's never settled.
No,
Um,
it's true. It's not science if it's settled, right?
exactly. Exactly. So
Science is open-ended.
yeah, yeah. And here's the other thing. I think this is one of the gifts of the restoration, right? Is to do what you and I just sat down and did. Do we know any of this for certain, Ken? I mean,
Oh, it's all facts. If you ask me, I'm telling you, it's all
yeah.
absolutely true, baby. I'm
But in all actuality,
staking myself on it.
yeah, in all actuality, I mean, we're making do with the best data that we have at the moment. But this is the
Yeah,
gift.
yeah,
I think this is one of the gifts of the restoration, right? Is that we can sit down and bounce these ideas around. But I think the most important thing in doing that is remembering that until you've had some sort of spiritual witness to some of these, an honest spiritual witness, they're just ideas, right?
yeah. Of
And there's
course.
nothing wrong with bouncing these. It's a tradition that is as Mormon as funeral potatoes, if not older,
Well,
right?
Joseph Smith, that's one of his favorite things to do. I
Yes.
can't. What was the phrase that he used to
Theologize.
to prove contraries?
Okay. Yeah.
That's what he called it, to
Yeah.
prove contraries. And he loved doing that. I mean, or as a friend of mine once said, if you're prepared enough to ask the right question, the answer can't be far behind. So if
Right.
we're not probing and if we're not pondering, right? That's a loaded word. If we're not doing our own best thinking and seeking for these answers, let us let us receive truth,
From wherever.
no matter from wherever it comes from whence it comes. That's what that is. You're right. That's a great Mormon tradition from Joseph Smith himself.
Yep. Absolutely.
So if
And,
we're asking the right questions,
right.
and if it is in God's timing that we should receive answers, we'll be prepared to receive it. We have to prime the pump.
Absolutely.
Or God doesn't,
Absolutely.
was it McConkie said, God does not pour revelation into a vacuum,
Right.
right?
Right. Well, and we forget this whole thing got kicked off by a young boy asking some questions,
That's
right?
right.
And I
That's right.
don't think that tradition ends with Joseph Smith.
Well, I want to go back and state one thing because, as we've talked about before, the geological record, the prehistoric geological record shows mass extinction events, right?
Sure.
So
Yep.
we have these creations like the
Okay.
Cambrian period. Then we have a mass extinction event, and all that stuff disappears, and entirely new life forms suddenly spring up on the planet, right? I forget. There's the Triassic, Jurassic, and then we have the Cretaceous period, which was the last period of the dinosaurs. Mass extinction event. They all disappear.
And then the Cambrian explosion, right?
Now the Cambrian was way before the
Way
dinosaurs, right?
before
That
that.
was
Okay.
500 million BC, and now we're talking dinosaur. The end of the Cretaceous was 65 to 70 million BC, and right after that, the tertiary, the KT boundaries, what they call it, whole new life form, mammalian life forms spring up and plant forms. And so the geological record, instead of being this continuous, small, gradual changes like they talk about, the Darwinists, it's not. It's like explosive creative periods, stagnation, extinction. A new explosive creative period with new life forms, stagnation. There's not any evolution going on, extinction. So it's a repeated introduction of new life forms,
Wow.
as Eric Skousen would put it. And that is so stark in the geological record that anthropologists, archaeologists have a term for it, and it's called oh my gosh, it blew my mind. But there's a term for it.
What does the term mean?
It's past my bedtime, I think. Um, it'll come to me. At any rate, they actually have a term for it. They've codified the theory of this repeated introductions. I'm so embarrassed I can't think of it. In any case, I personally believe that's what happens. These mass extinction events are so profound and so catastrophic that I don't think anything survived, and God or somebody was preparing for a new creation, a new world. Um, in any case, so which would explain. So I would say that before Adam was placed on the earth, that the earth was again cleansed and prepared for the presence,
Right.
cleansed of the caveman and all that sort of stuff. And prior to that, Neanderthal. Prior to that, Denisovian. Could they have been on the earth at the same time? Why not? Right. But the real question, if there was this repeated introduction of new life forms, why would the humanoid species bear any resemblance to each other if they were from different worlds and time periods?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Good question.
My question is, why not? Right? If we're humanoids created in the image and glory of God, why would that change? Now, yes, there are different species, but as we approach the time of Adam, those species appear more and more like Homo
Right.
sapien, like Adam. And so, why? And then, if Adam was brought here from another world, like Brigham Young speculated, why would he not? Why would there not be that commonality in
Right.
in the form of mortal man? Yeah. So that shouldn't surprise me or anybody else.
No. No.
Oh man, it's on the tip of my tongue. It's almost happening. Oh, I'm not gonna get it.
It's all right.
Uh,
It's all right. Ken, as always, dude, this was good stuff, my man.
oh, thanks. I was. This was a lot of fun. It was a lot of homework, but um, and really, I mean, I'd lose sleep, all this stuff rattling in my around in my brain, and trying to make sense of these migration patterns of these haplogroups and how that would relate to LDS teachings, and biblical history and all that sort of stuff. So it's been a delightful tour for me as well.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
See ya. Thanks.